I want you to imagine, just for a second, the absolute pitch-black isolation of a rural Midwestern town back in the 1970s. You know, the kind of heavy, suffocating dark where your porch light barely illuminates a few feet of howling wind and creepy, shifting shadows. Well, today, we're going to unpack a seriously scary legend. We are going to thoroughly gut this legend, dissecting a terrifying cryptid hunt that literally turned a small Illinois town completely upside down. We're talking about the infamous Enfield Horror. In this explainer, we'll walk through the chilling eyewitness accounts, the bizarre physical evidence, and ultimately, we're going to peel back the layers to look at the fascinating and honestly way more dangerous psychological reality hiding underneath it all. So settle in, because this whole thing gets incredibly strange.
It really begs the ultimate question, doesn't it? What actually happens when a bump in the night ends up holding an entire town hostage? Let's set the scene. The date is April 25th, 1973. We're in Enfield, Illinois. It's this quiet, completely unsuspecting little community surrounded by just vast open fields and dense brush. It was a dark, intensely windy night, and pretty much the whole town was fast asleep. But, you know, in a story like this, it always starts with just one person, one isolated home, and a terrifying intrusion from the absolute unknown.
So it was right around 9:30 p.m. Local resident Henry McDaniel was just chilling inside his house with his family, a totally ordinary night, until this deeply unsettling sound completely shattered the quiet. It was a distinct, persistent scratching coming from right outside his front door. Now, living out in the country, McDaniel's first logical assumption, as I'm sure yours or mine would be, was that some stray animal, maybe a dog or, maybe even a bear, was just pawing at the screen door. Not taking any chances whatsoever, McDaniel grabs his pistol and a flashlight. He boldly opens the door and steps right out onto his porch into that rushing wind, fully expecting to just scare off some wandering beast. But what his flashlight beam actually caught standing between two rose bushes? Yeah, it was anything but ordinary.
What McDaniel describes seeing in that beam of light is literally pure nightmare fuel. He definitely didn't see a bear. He reported seeing this grotesque, grayish-colored monstrosity standing about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. He said it had this short, almost human-like body, and jutting out from its chest area were two little stubby arms. But here's where it gets wild, the details that make this account legendary, the stuff you just can't brush off, the eyes and the legs. McDaniel claimed the creature had two massive, pink eyes that glowed as bright as flashlights. And incredibly, he swore up and down that the creature stood on 3 legs. No, not a tail touching the ground, not a mangled limb, but 3 distinct, functional legs.
Okay, let's dive into this, because McDaniel's reaction is exactly what you might expect from a guy suddenly faced with an impossible monster right on his doorstep. He didn't just freeze, he raised his pistol and he fired. From a distance of just 12 feet away, he squeezed off 4 shots directly at the beast, and he was absolutely certain he hit it with that very first shot. But the bullets, they seemed to do absolutely nothing. The creature didn't fall. Instead, it reacted by letting out this vicious, blood-curdling hiss, a sound McDaniel said was a lot like a really angry wildcat. And then it bolted. But it didn't just run away like a normal animal. McDaniel watched in absolute horror as this bizarre entity bounded 50 to 70 feet toward a brush-lined railroad embankment in just 3 massive leaps. I mean, think about the physics of that for a second. That is a staggering, almost impossible distance for a creature only 4 feet tall.
Almost immediately after this, the community started trying to validate the terror. Reports practically started coming out of the woodwork to back up McDaniel's wild story. Now, the most famous of these was from a 10-year-old neighbor named Greg Garrett. The claim went that just 30 minutes before McDaniel's encounter, this same creature had jumped from the bushes in the boy's backyard and literally stomped on his feet, tearing his sneakers to shreds before the terrified kid could run inside. This specific detail gets repeated constantly in cryptozoology lore. However, when we actually gut the legend here, we find that the cracks were already starting to show. You see, sociologists later interviewed the family, and Greg and his parents admitted the whole shoe-tearing incident was nothing but a prank. They literally destroyed a perfectly good pair of sneakers just to tease their eccentric neighbor McDaniel and to mess with a visiting newsman. But of course, by the time the actual truth came out, the rumor mill was already spinning wildly out of control. Even with that prank completely exposed, Henry McDaniel stood firmly, and I mean firmly, by his initial terrifying encounter. In fact, he actually escalated the narrative significantly. He started telling anyone who would listen, and I quote, "If they do find it, they will find more than one, and they won't be from this planet, I can tell you that." Now, this is a massive turning point in our story. McDaniel wasn't just describing some undiscovered woodland animal anymore. He was heavily suggesting an extraterrestrial or maybe even a demonic presence. By using the strongest language available to him, he was signaling to the entire town that whatever was lurking out by those railroad tracks simply didn't belong to any world he recognized. The fear instantly evolved from a strange animal sighting into a full-blown paranormal event.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the speed at which this whole thing escalated is just phenomenal. After that initial shock on April 25th, the story could have easily just faded away. But then, on May 6th, McDaniel stokes the fires all over again. He claims he saw the creature a second time, right around 3 a.m., just casually ambling down the nearby railroad tracks. That second sighting, that kept the case alive. It meant the creature hadn't moved on. It was still out there hiding in the dark. And then, just 2 days later, on May 8th, outside monster hunters are already hiding in the brush, actively firing their weapons at what they claimed was a gray, hairy thing moving way faster than a man could ever run. In less than 2 weeks, Enfield went from a sleepy little town to total, unhinged chaos. And look, this chaos wasn't just driven by empty ghost stories. There were actual physical and auditory traces that just kept pouring gasoline on the panic. Local police actually responded to the McDaniel home and reportedly observed unusual tracks right near the porch. They described them as dog-like, but strangely, with 6 distinct toe pads. Plaster casts were supposedly taken, though definitively solving what they belonged to remained frustratingly elusive. Then things get crazier. A news director from a radio station named WWKI travels to Enfield with a full crew. They didn't just report on the scared town. They basically became part of the story, claiming they themselves saw an ape-like creature in an abandoned barn, and they even recorded its creepy vocalizations. Even highly experienced monster hunters, like the famous cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, arrived on the scene and reported hearing, in his own words, the most ungodly, piercing shriek you can imagine. I mean, when the experts show up and say something is out there, people definitely listen.
The entire situation hit critical mass when McDaniel actually gave a live interview to WGN Radio all the way up in Chicago. That broadcast essentially turned the key on the invasion of Enfield. The story crossed a massive threshold. It was no longer just local gossip being whispered over backyard fences. It was a sensational headline blasting across the entire American Midwest. The quiet little town suddenly found itself at ground zero of an absolute media frenzy. Reporters, thrill seekers, and heavily armed amateur monster hunters began pouring in by the carload, all desperate to track down the beast with the pink eyes. Now, it's really important to put this all into context too. Enfield wasn't just operating in a vacuum here. This era was actually a prime time for bizarre creature sightings all across the Midwest. The 1970s experienced what cryptozoologists call a massive flap of monster lore. We're talking widespread reports of everything from phantom kangaroos to the Murfreesboro mud monster, and of course the infamous Momo, the Missouri monster. Loren Coleman himself actually tied the Enfield Horror to this larger cycle of regional strangeness, comparing it to an ape or maybe a devil-monkey situation. The Enfield Horror perfectly tapped into this existing widespread anxiety and deep fascination with undiscovered monsters hiding just past the edge of the woods.
So, the crucial point is, this brings us to a terrifying pivot in the story. We actually have to step back from the glowing red eyes and the 3 legs for a minute and look at the absolute, documented reality of what was actually happening on the ground. When we strip away the myth from the facts, a very dark picture emerges, but definitely not because of a cryptid. The myth, of course, was that some invincible alien was stalking the neighborhood. But the documented reality? The reality was that Enfield was actively being overrun by strangers who were heavily armed, highly paranoid, and absolutely desperate to shoot themselves a monster. The real horror of Enfield wasn't supernatural at all. It was entirely human. This is where the story gets incredibly, genuinely dangerous. You had random people driving in from out of state with shotguns and high-powered rifles, just tramping through residents' backyards and local brush in the pitch black, shooting wildly at every snapping twig and strange shadow they saw. The actual residents of Enfield became terrified, not of the 3-legged monster, but of the trigger-happy monster hunters. They were legitimately terrified someone was going to get accidentally killed in the crossfire. The situation grew so severe that White County authorities finally had to step in, ultimately arresting 5 young men from out of town who were caught actively hunting the creature. They were slapped with hunting violations, basically as a desperate public safety measure just to stop the reckless gunfire in the dark.
It was precisely at this insane boiling point that a completely different kind of investigator arrived on the scene. Researchers from Western Illinois University came down to Enfield. But unlike the radio crews or the amateur hunters with their shotguns, these academics did not come to track down a three-legged alien. Nope, they came to study the terrified people of Enfield. They recognized that regardless of whether the physical creature actually existed or not, the town's massive reaction to the rumor was a monumental event in itself. So they started interviewing the locals, systematically trying to untangle the first-hand claims from the wildly spun third-hand gossip. And this brilliantly illustrates what they found. The researchers from Western Illinois University eventually published a whole paper using the Enfield case as a literal textbook example of social contagion. Now, what is that? It's the psychological phenomenon where a group of people, influenced by intense fear, heavy expectation, and a constant swirling stream of dramatic information, basically begin to share the exact same heightened emotions. It leads to actual panics, collective visions, and extreme suggestibility. The town was caught in this massive feedback loop, where the more people talked about the monster, the more undeniably real it became to everyone, which fundamentally altered how the entire community behaved.
The sociologists broke down exactly how a legend is born out of this kind of contagion into 3 really clear steps. Step 1, a frightening, anomalous report occurs. Right, Henry McDaniel sees something at his door he just can't explain. Step 2, that isolated report becomes a town conversation, amplified by local anxiety and, as we saw with the neighbor kid, even deliberate pranks. Step 3, the conversation solidifies into a widely accepted rumor. Suddenly, the creature has a specific description, a cool name, a set of known behaviors. And finally, that rumor triggers a dangerous physical reality. Armed men literally showing up to hunt a phantom. A single man's fright at his front door literally manifested into a very real, community-wide crisis.
Yet despite all the reckless gunfire, all the crazy media attention, and all the deep sociological research, we are still left with intensely frustrating, unresolved pieces to this puzzle. Nobody ever captured an animal. Not a single shred of hair, blood, or biological evidence was ever confirmed. Those plaster casts of the 6-toed tracks, they never resulted in any definitive public lab conclusion. And while skeptics and wildlife officials suggested super mundane explanations, misidentified bears, escaped apes, or even a stray kangaroo, none of these explanations ever truly satisfied the locals who actually lived through the terror. The physical proof just vanished into the dark, exactly like the creature itself.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the profound kind of uncomfortable question it forces us to ask. When that radio crew saw an ape-like creature, or when those outside hunters claimed to hear shrieks in the brush, were they actually seeing the exact same physical beast that Henry McDaniel saw? Or were they simply seeing what they desperately expected to see because they'd been so heavily primed by the media coverage? Does a whole crowd of witnesses actually prove a monster is real, or does it merely prove that the human mind's power of suggestion is incredibly potent? It really challenges everything we think we know about the reliability of eyewitness testimony, especially in the dark.
We started this explainer by asking what happens when a bump in the night holds a whole town hostage. Well, the answer is found right here. What happens to a small town when enough people start acting like the unknown is real? The true, undeniable horror of Enfield, Illinois, back in 1973, wasn't some bulletproof alien with pink eyes. It was the terrifying, heavily documented power of mass hysteria. A simple rumor became so incredibly powerful that it drew guns, caused arrests, and fundamentally changed a community. Whether that creature was flesh and blood, an extraterrestrial visitor, or just a trick of the shadows, the human reaction to it was very, very real. And honestly, that lingering psychological mystery is perhaps the most enduring and the most unsettling legacy of the Enfield monster.